I woke up to the smell of smoke burning into my lungs. My son had set the house on fire while I was asleep. I was trapped without the strength or voice to scream, but somehow I escaped. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor, and I'm 74 years old. I live in a small apartment on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, where the sound of traffic never stops and the smell of different cultures cooking their meals drifts through thin walls day and night. My hands shake a little when I hold my coffee cup in the mornings, not from age, but from the memories that still wake me at 3 in the morning. The burn scars on my forearms have faded to pale lines, but the invisible scars on my heart remain raw and tender. 6 months ago, I was living in a different world entirely. I was in my modest 2-story house in Queens, the same house where I raised my son Michael for 35 years. The same house where I scraped together every dollar to pay the mortgage after my husband left us when Michael was 12. The same house where I worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table and clothes on his growing body. The wallpaper was peeling in the kitchen, and the floorboards creaked in all the familiar places, but it was mine. It was home. That October night changed everything. I can still feel the weight of exhaustion pulling me into sleep. I had been working a double shift at the diner where I waited tables, my feet swollen and aching, my lower back screaming from carrying heavy plates and bending over tables for 14 hours straight. I was 73 years old and still working like a woman half my age, not because I wanted to, but because Michael needed money. Again. Always again. The smoke came first as a whisper in my dreams. Then it grew thicker, more insistent, until I jolted awake gasping and choking. My bedroom was filled with gray clouds that burned my eyes and throat. The smell was acrid, chemical, wrong. Not the gentle smoke from a fireplace or even burnt toast. This was the smell of deliberate destruction, of gasoline and rage and something darker that I couldn't name. I tried to call out, but my voice was barely a rasp. 60 years of smoking had already weakened my lungs, and the pneumonia I'd battled the year before had left me fragile. I rolled out of bed onto my hands and knees, crawling toward the bedroom door like a wounded animal. The floor was warm beneath my palms. Too warm. The heat was rising from below, from the kitchen where I had left Michael just hours before. My son Michael. 35 years old, still living in my house, still taking my money, still looking at me with those eyes full of resentment and entitlement that I had somehow learned to accept as normal. He had been drinking again that night. I could smell the whiskey on his breath when he stumbled through the front door at 11 o'clock, his face twisted with that familiar anger that seemed to follow him everywhere. "Mom, I need $2,000, he had said, not asked. Said. As if my bank account was his personal ATM. As if I hadn't already given him $3,000 just last month for what he called a business opportunity that never materialized. As if I wasn't already eating cereal for dinner most nights to stretch my Social Security check to cover his needs and mine. I had said no that night. For the first time in years, I had looked at my son and said no. The word felt foreign in my mouth, like speaking a language I had forgotten. His face had darkened, and he had slammed his fist against the kitchen counter, making my collection of ceramic roosters rattle on their shelf. "You're a selfish old woman," he had hissed. "After everything I've done for you." Everything he had done for me. The words still burn more than any smoke ever could. What exactly had he done for me? He had dropped out of 3 colleges that I paid for. He had brought his drug-dealing friends into my home, leaving needles in my bathroom and strangers sleeping on my couch. He had stolen my jewelry to sell when he thought I wouldn't notice. He had screamed at me in front of the neighbors when I asked him to help with groceries. He had brought women home who looked at me like I was dirt under their shoes, whispering about how pathetic it was that I was still supporting a grown man. But I had swallowed it all. I had made excuses and rationalized and told myself that this was what mothers do. We sacrifice. We give until there's nothing left to give, and then we find more to give anyway. Because blood is thicker than water. Because family is everything. Because surely, someday, he would remember all my love and return just a little bit of it. That night, as I crawled through the smoke toward my bedroom door, I realized that someday would never come. The hallway was an inferno. Orange flames licked the walls where family photos used to hang. Pictures of Michael's first steps, his school graduations, birthday parties where I had managed to scrape together enough money for a cake and a few presents. All of it was burning. All of it was turning to ash and memory. I could hear him downstairs, my son, my baby, the boy I had rocked to sleep for the first 5 years of his life. He was talking on his phone, his voice calm and measured. "Yeah, it's going pretty good," he was saying. "Should be completely gone in about 20 minutes. The insurance will cover everything, plus emotional damages for losing my poor old mom." My poor old mom. That's what I had become in his mind. Not Eleanor, who had worked her fingers to the bone for him. Not the woman who had sat up all night when he had the flu, who had defended him to teachers and neighbors and social workers who tried to warn me that I was raising a monster. I was just his poor old mom, an obstacle to an insurance payout, a problem to be solved with gasoline and a match. The floor was getting hotter. I could feel the heat through my old flannel nightgown, the one I had worn for 15 years because I couldn't afford to buy new clothes when Michael always needed something more important than his mother's comfort. My throat was closing up from the smoke, and black spots were dancing at the edges of my vision. I was dying in the house I had spent 30 years paying for, murdered by the son I had spent 35 years loving. But something inside me refused to give up. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was rage. Maybe it was the ghost of the young woman I used to be, the one who had started over after my husband left, who had learned to fix leaky pipes and change flat tires and balance a checkbook with dollars and cents written in my own shaking handwriting. That woman was still somewhere inside me, buried under years of exhaustion and manipulation and misplaced maternal guilt. I made it to the window in the guest bedroom, the one that faced the narrow alley between my house and Mrs. Chen's. The old wooden frame had warped over the years, and I had to put my full weight against it to make it budge. The cool October air hit my face like a blessing. The ground looked impossibly far away, but staying meant death, and I had already been dying slowly for years. I climbed out onto the slanted roof over the back porch, the same roof where I used to hang Christmas lights every December, even when money was tight, because I wanted Michael to have magic in his childhood. The shingles were slippery with dew, and my bare feet struggled for purchase on the rough surface. Below me, I could see the faint glow of flames through the kitchen windows. I could still hear Michael's voice, calculating and cold, making plans for his future without me. The jump to Mrs. Chen's fire escape was only about 4 feet, but it might as well have been 4 miles. I was 73 years old with arthritis in both knees and a heart that had been broken so many times I was surprised it was still beating. But I thought about that insurance money Michael was already spending in his head. I thought about how he would probably cry at my funeral, playing the part of the grieving son, accepting condolences from neighbors who had no idea what kind of man he really was. I jumped. My landing was anything but graceful. I hit the metal fire escape hard, scraping my palms and knees, tearing my nightgown on the sharp edges. But I was alive. I was outside. I was breathing air that didn't taste like my own death. Mrs. Chen found me there 20 minutes later, shivering and bleeding and watching my house burn. She wrapped her own robe around my shoulders and held me while I sobbed, not for the house or the memories or the things that were turning to ash, but for the son I had lost long before he tried to kill me. The fire department came, of course. And the police. And the paramedics who checked my vitals and cleaned my wounds and kept asking if I was in shock. Michael played his part perfectly. He was the distraught son who had barely escaped the blaze himself, who was devastated about his poor mother who hadn't made it out. He even managed to produce tears when the fire chief told him they were still searching for my body in the wreckage. His performance was almost convincing. Almost. But Mrs. Chen had seen me on her fire escape. She had heard his phone conversations while I was supposedly dying. And when the investigators found the gasoline residue in multiple rooms, when they discovered that the smoke detectors had been disabled, when they realized that the fire had been set in a pattern designed to trap someone on the second floor, Michael's story began to fall apart like wet tissue paper. I spent that first night in the hospital, not because of my injuries, which were minor, but because I had nowhere else to go. My house was gone. My possessions were gone. My son was in jail, charged with attempted murder and insurance fraud. I was alive, but I was completely and utterly alone in a way I had never been before. That should have been the end of my story. The tragic tale of an elderly woman betrayed by her own child, left with nothing but the charity of strangers and the clothes on her back. But sometimes, when you lose everything, you discover that you still have the most important thing of all, yourself. The insurance company, after a thorough investigation, refused to pay out on a policy taken out fraudulently with intent to commit murder. Michael's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, claiming that his client was mentally ill, that he had substance abuse problems, that he had never intended to hurt anyone. The prosecutor, a stern woman about my age with steel gray hair and eyes to match, wasn't interested in excuses. Mrs. Hamilton, she said to me during one of our meetings, your son planned this carefully. He disabled the smoke detectors. He blocked the main stairway with furniture soaked in accelerant. He called his insurance agent while you were supposedly burning to death. This wasn't a moment of madness. This was premeditated murder for financial gain. Premeditated murder. The words felt surreal, like dialogue from a television crime show. Mothers aren't supposed to hear those words applied to their children. Children aren't supposed to plot their parents' deaths. But there I was, sitting in a prosecutor's office, looking at photographs of my burned house and police reports that laid out my son's betrayal in clinical, devastating detail. The hardest part wasn't accepting that Michael had tried to kill me. The hardest part was accepting that the signs had been there all along, and I had chosen to ignore them. The lies, the stealing, the way he looked at me sometimes like I was already dead. The way he had started asking questions about my will, about my insurance policies, about what would happen to the house if something happened to me. I had explained it all away. He was going through a rough patch. He had addiction issues. He was still grieving his father's abandonment. He just needed time to get back on his feet. I had made excuses until making excuses became a full-time job, until I was so exhausted from defending him that I didn't have energy left to protect myself. The social worker assigned to my case, a kind woman named Sarah with gentle eyes and stubborn optimism, helped me find temporary housing in a senior living facility in the Bronx. It was clean and safe, but it felt like living in a hospital. Everything was beige and sanitized and designed for people who were waiting to die. The other residents looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and pity. I was the woman whose son had tried to burn her alive. I was the cautionary tale they would whisper about over their morning coffee. I spent my days sitting by the window, watching traffic crawl through the streets below, wondering what I was supposed to do with whatever years I had left. I was 73 years old with no home, no family, and no idea who I was supposed to be now that I wasn't Michael's mother anymore. The trial was scheduled for the spring. Michael's lawyer had warned me that it would be brutal, that they would try to paint me as a neglectful mother who had driven her son to desperation. They would bring up every mistake I had ever made, every time I had been too tired or too poor or too overwhelmed to be perfect. They would argue that I was partly responsible for my own attempted murder. I almost didn't testify. The thought of sitting in that courtroom, looking at Michael across the room while lawyers dissected our relationship like a biology lab experiment, made me physically ill. But Sarah reminded me that this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every other parent who might find themselves in my situation, every other elderly person who trusted the wrong family member with their life. "You survived for a reason, Eleanor," she told me one gray February afternoon as snow began to dust the windows of the facility. "Maybe this is it." The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, more intimate. I had imagined something grand and dramatic, like in the movies, but this was just a plain room with fluorescent lighting and uncomfortable chairs. Michael sat at the defendant's table in a clean suit that his lawyer had probably bought for him, his hair cut short, his face carefully composed in an expression of remorse that I recognized as practiced. He looked so young sitting there. So much like the little boy who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms, who used to bring me dandelions from the backyard and call them flowers. For a moment, I almost forgot why we were there. For a moment, I almost stood up and told everyone that this was all a mistake, that I would take him home and we would figure it out together. Then the prosecutor showed the photographs. My house, reduced to a skeleton of blackened beams and melted siding. The guest room where I had slept, where the floor had been weakened deliberately to ensure that I would fall through into the flames below if the smoke didn't kill me first. The gasoline residue patterns that spelled out his intent as clearly as a written confession. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the witness stand on legs that felt like water. The bailiff asked me to state my name for the record, and for a moment, I couldn't remember it. I had been Michael's mother for so long that I had forgotten I was Eleanor Hamilton first. "Eleanor Marie Hamilton," I said finally, my voice stronger than I had expected. The prosecutor was gentle with me, walking me through the events of that night step by step. I told them about the conversation in the kitchen, about waking up to smoke, about hearing him on the phone while I crawled through the burning house. I told them about jumping from the roof, about watching my life turn to ash while my son calculated his profit. Michael's lawyer tried to rattle me during cross-examination. He asked about my parenting, about Michael's childhood, about whether I had ever considered that my enabling behavior had contributed to his problems. He suggested that I was exaggerating the events, that perhaps I had misheard the phone conversation, that maybe Michael had been trying to save me and I had misunderstood. "Mrs. Hamilton," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "isn't it possible that you're confused about what happened that night? After all, you had been working long hours, you had been under stress, you had been taking medication for your anxiety." I looked at him for a long moment, this man who was being paid to convince 12 strangers that my son's attempt to murder me was somehow my fault. Then I looked at Michael, who was staring at the table, unable to meet my eyes. "Young man," I said finally, my voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, "I may be old, but I'm not stupid. I heard what I heard. I saw what I saw. My son tried to kill me for money. That's not confusion. That's fact." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Michael was found guilty on all counts: attempted murder in the first degree, arson in the first degree, and insurance fraud. The judge sentenced him to 25 years to life, which meant that if he was very lucky and very good, he might be released when he was 60 years old. As they led him away in handcuffs, he finally looked at me. His eyes were filled with tears, but I couldn't tell if they were tears of remorse or tears of self-pity for getting caught. I wanted to feel something for him in that moment. Love, forgiveness, grief for the relationship we would never have. Instead, I felt nothing at all. The part of me that had been his mother had burned up in that house along with everything else. After the trial, I had to start over in a way that most people never have to experience. I was 74 years old with no home, no possessions, and a family history that would make social workers nervous for the rest of my life. The insurance money from the house fire would eventually come through, but legal proceedings take time, and I needed somewhere to live while lawyers and bureaucrats sorted through the paperwork. That's when Mrs. Chen, my elderly neighbor who had found me on her fire escape, made an offer that changed my life. Her daughter lived in Manhattan and had been trying to convince her to move to a senior living community. Mrs. Chen had been resisting because she couldn't afford the kind of place that would accept her small, elderly dog, an ancient Chihuahua named Mr. Pickles who had been her companion for 12 years. "Eleanor," she said one afternoon as we sat in the sterile visiting room of my temporary housing facility, "I have an idea that might help both of us." Her daughter had found a 2-bedroom apartment on the Lower East Side that would allow pets, but Mrs. Chen couldn't afford the rent on her Social Security alone. If I was willing to split the cost and help her care for Mr. Pickles, we could be roommates. 2 elderly women, both starting over, both learning that family doesn't always mean blood. I moved in with Mrs. Chen and Mr. Pickles on a rainy Thursday in April, 6 months after the fire. The apartment was tiny, a 4th-floor walk-up with thin walls and thinner bank accounts, but it had something my house in Queens never had: peace. No one was yelling at me for money. No one was bringing strangers into my home. No one was looking at me like I was an obstacle to their happiness. Mrs. Chen, whose first name was Linda, turned out to be a remarkable woman. She had immigrated from Taiwan in 1962 with her husband and 2 small children, speaking almost no English and carrying everything they owned in 3 suitcases. Her husband had died 15 years ago, and her children lived busy lives in other states, visiting once or twice a year with grandchildren who barely knew her name. We were both women who had given everything to families who had moved on without us. The difference was that Linda had learned to build a life for herself anyway. She had friends at the community center, hobbies that brought her joy, routines that belonged to no one but her. She taught me that there was life after motherhood, that identity could exist beyond sacrifice. Our days developed a rhythm that was completely foreign to me. We would wake up slowly, without alarm clocks, and drink coffee while Mr. Pickles performed his morning inspection of the apartment. Linda would read the Chinese-language newspaper while I worked through the crossword puzzle in the daily news. Sometimes we would talk, sharing stories about our old lives and our tentative plans for our new ones. Sometimes we would sit in comfortable silence, 2 women who had survived their families and were finally learning to enjoy their own company. The neighborhood was vibrant in a way that Queens never was. Our building sat above a bodega where Mrs. Rodriguez knew everyone's names and preferences. The old man who ran the corner newsstand always saved us the crossword books when the new shipments came in. The young mother in 2B would smile and nod when we passed on the stairs, her toddler waving shyly from behind her legs. I started taking walks by myself, something I hadn't done in years. In Queens, I had been afraid to leave Michael alone for too long, worried about what kind of trouble he might find or create in my absence. Now, I could wander through the Lower East Side for hours, watching the changing neighborhoods, the mixture of old and new, immigrant families running corner shops next to hipster coffee houses and luxury condos. One afternoon, as I was walking through Sarah Delano Roosevelt Park, I saw a group of older women gathered around a picnic table, their heads bent over what looked like art supplies. Curiosity overcame shyness, and I approached close enough to see that they were painting watercolor landscapes, portraits of their grandchildren, abstract swirls of color that seemed to come from someplace deeper than technique or training. "You can join us if you want," said a woman with silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her name was Ruth, and she had been meeting with this informal group for 3 years, ever since her husband died, and she realized she needed to do something with her hands besides folding his empty clothes. No experience required. Just bring yourself. I hadn't touched a paintbrush since high school art class, but something about the invitation appealed to me. The idea that I could create something, anything, that belonged only to me felt revolutionary. I bought a basic watercolor set at the art supply store on Grand Street and showed up the following Tuesday with hands that shook from nervousness rather than age. My first painting was terrible. A lopsided tree with colors that ran together in muddy puddles. But it was mine. I had made it with my own hands, my own choices, my own vision of what a tree should look like. Ruth looked at it with the seriousness of a museum curator and pronounced it a good start. Over the weeks that followed, the painting group became the anchor of my schedule. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons in the park, weather permitting, or in the community center when it rained. I painted flowers that looked like abstract explosions, cityscapes that bore no resemblance to New York, portraits of Mr. Pickles that made him look like a mythical creature. None of it was technically accomplished, but all of it was authentically mine. The other women in the group had stories that overlapped with mine in uncomfortable ways. Ruth's adult children lived across the country and called on Christmas and birthdays, if they remembered. Maria's son had stolen her retirement savings to fund a gambling addiction before disappearing entirely. Janet's daughter brought the grandchildren for visits but spent the entire time criticizing Janet's housekeeping, her cooking, her appearance, her life choices. We were a collection of women who had loved too much and received too little, who had sacrificed ourselves on the altar of family obligation until there was almost nothing left to sacrifice. But we were still here. We were still learning. We were still growing. The paintings were proof that we had survived our own generosity. As the months passed, I began to understand that the fire had destroyed more than just my house. It had burned away the version of myself that I had constructed around Michael's needs, his demands, his vision of who I should be. Eleanor the enabler, Eleanor the victim, Eleanor the woman who apologized for taking up space in her own life. That woman had died in the smoke, and I was finally free to become whoever I wanted to be instead. The freedom was terrifying at first. I had been defined by other people's needs for so long that I had forgotten what my own needs even were. Did I like coffee or tea? I had always made whatever Michael preferred. Did I enjoy watching television or reading books? I had never had time for either when I was working multiple jobs to support his lifestyle. What did I want to be when I grew up? At 74, I was starting over with that question. Linda helped me navigate these discoveries with patience and humor. She introduced me to Chinese cooking, teaching me to make dumplings from scratch while Mr. Pickles supervised from his cushion by the window. She showed me how to use the computer at the community center to research topics that interested me, how to find library books about art history and travel writing and women who had reinvented themselves later in life. You are not too old to become whoever you want to be, she told me one evening as we worked side by side in our tiny kitchen, her hands expert with the dumpling wrappers while mine fumbled with the filling. In my country, we say that life has many seasons. Maybe your spring is just beginning. My spring. The idea that I might be entering a season of growth rather than decline felt radical. I had spent so many years thinking of myself as someone whose best days were behind her, whose purpose in life was to serve others until I was used up completely. But what if that wasn't true? What if the most interesting part of my story was just beginning? 6 months after moving in with Linda, I received a letter that changed everything. It was from a lawyer I had never heard of, informing me that my great-aunt Dorothy, my grandmother's sister who had moved to California before I was born, had died at age 98 and left me her house in Monterey. I barely remembered Aunt Dorothy. She had sent Christmas cards when I was a child, always signed with elaborate cursive writing and containing $5 bills that seemed like tremendous wealth to my young self. My mother had spoken of her rarely, and always with a mixture of admiration and resentment. Dorothy had been the sister who escaped, who traveled, who never married or had children, who lived what my mother considered a selfish life. According to the lawyer's letter, Dorothy had been following my life from a distance. She knew about my marriage, my divorce, Michael's troubled history, even the fire and the trial. She had left me her house, her savings, and a letter that explained her decision. Eleanor, the letter began in that same elaborate cursive I remembered from childhood Christmas cards. I have watched you sacrifice yourself for people who didn't deserve your devotion. I did the opposite. I chose myself, always, sometimes to a fault. Maybe you can find a balance that I never achieved. Maybe you can be generous to others without being cruel to yourself. The house is yours to do with as you please. Sell it, live in it, rent it out, burn it down. It's your choice now. Make choices that make you happy. The house was a small bungalow 2 blocks from Monterey Bay, with a garden that had been lovingly maintained and windows that looked out over the Pacific Ocean. The lawyer sent photographs, hand-painted tiles in the bathroom, built-in bookshelves filled with travel guides and art books, a sunroom that would be perfect for painting. It was everything I had never known I wanted. Linda and I spent hours looking at the photographs and discussing possibilities. I could sell the New York apartment, use the insurance money from the fire, and have enough to live comfortably in California for the rest of my life. Mr. Pickles would love having a yard to explore. Linda could come visit, or even relocate if she wanted to try a new adventure. But there was another option that I hadn't expected to consider. I could stay in New York, keep the apartment with Linda, and rent out the California house to provide additional income. I could have security without isolation, independence without abandoning the first real friendship I had built as an adult. The decision surprised me with its clarity. I wanted to stay in New York. Not the New York of my marriage or my motherhood, not the Queens where I had worked myself to exhaustion supporting Michael's dreams and addictions. I wanted to stay in this New York, the Lower East Side where I had learned to paint and learned to choose myself, where I had discovered that home could mean something other than sacrifice. I used Aunt Dorothy's inheritance to buy the apartment from our landlord, ensuring that Linda and I would never have to worry about rent increases or eviction. I kept the California house as a rental property, managed by a local company that sent me monthly checks and photographs of the garden's seasonal changes. For the first time in my adult life, I had more money than I strictly needed, and I was learning how to spend it on things that brought me joy rather than guilt. Michael wrote to me from prison after the first year. The letter was 4 pages of apologies and explanations, promises of rehabilitation and requests for forgiveness. He had found religion, he said. He was getting clean, working in the prison library, earning his GED. He understood now how much he had hurt me, how wrong he had been, how grateful he was that I had survived his terrible mistake. His terrible mistake. Even in his apology, he couldn't quite bring himself to call it what it was, attempted murder. It was still a mistake, an accident, a moment of poor judgment rather than a deliberate choice to kill his mother for money. I read the letter 3 times, looking for something genuine in his words, some recognition of the magnitude of what he had done. Instead, I found manipulation dressed up as repentance, the same emotional blackmail he had been using on me since childhood. He was sorry that I had been hurt, but he wasn't sorry for hurting me. He regretted getting caught, but he didn't regret the crime. I wrote back once, a short note that I hoped would be final. Michael, I hope you do find peace and purpose in your life. I have found mine. I will not be responding to future letters, and I will not be visiting. Take care of yourself. I didn't sign it Love, Mom, because I was no longer his mom in any way that mattered. I was Eleanor Hamilton, a woman who had survived her own son's attempt to murder her and had built a life worth living anyway. The second year after the fire brought changes I hadn't anticipated. My painting had progressed enough that Ruth convinced me to enter a piece in the community center's annual art show. It was a watercolor of Mr. Pickles sleeping in a patch of sunlight by our apartment window, and while it was still amateur work, it captured something real about the contentment I had found in my new life. The painting sold on the opening night of the show for $50 to a young couple who said it reminded them of their own elderly dog. $50 wasn't life-changing money, but the fact that someone wanted to hang my art on their wall, wanted to look at something I had created every day, felt like a victory I had never expected to achieve. I started taking classes at the community college, audit courses that I attended for the pure joy of learning rather than the necessity of earning grades. Art history, where I discovered that some of the world's greatest painters hadn't produced their best work until they were older than I was now. Creative writing, where I began putting my story into words that belonged to me rather than lawyers and social workers and court reporters. Linda and I began traveling together, short trips at first. Weekend visits to museums in Philadelphia, a week in Martha's Vineyard where we stayed in a bed and breakfast and spent our days painting the harbor from different angles. We were like teenagers discovering independence for the first time, except we were in our 70s and allowed to drink wine with lunch. The biggest trip came in our 3rd year of friendship, when I used some of Aunt Dorothy's inheritance to take us both to Taiwan so Linda could visit the village where she had been born. I had never been outside the United States, and the flight terrified me, but Linda held my hand during takeoff and taught me enough Mandarin to order tea and say thank you. Taiwan was nothing like I had expected and everything Linda had described. The night markets full of foods I couldn't identify but wanted to try. The temples with their elaborate decorations and crowds of worshippers burning incense for ancestors I couldn't name. The village where Linda's childhood home had been replaced by modern apartments, but where elderly neighbors still remembered her family and welcomed us with tears and shared meals. I watched Linda reconnect with her past, speaking in rapid Mandarin with women her own age who had known her as a young bride leaving everything familiar for an uncertain future in America. I saw her transform from the quiet roommate I knew into the animated storyteller she had been before decades of adaptation and loss had taught her to make herself smaller. For the first time, I understood that reinvention wasn't just possible, it was necessary. We weren't the same women we had been at 30 or 50 or even 70. We were evolving, becoming more ourselves with each year that passed, each choice we made for our own happiness rather than someone else's approval. On our last night in Taipei, as we sat in a rooftop restaurant overlooking the city lights, Linda raised her glass of wine and toasted our friendship. To women who refuse to disappear, she said, and I felt the truth of those words settle into my bones. I had been disappearing for years, bit by bit, sacrifice by sacrifice, until there was almost nothing left of Eleanor Hamilton except the role she played in other people's lives. But I was back now. I was visible again, even to myself. The years that followed blurred together in the best possible way. Not the gray blur of depression and routine that had characterized my life before the fire, but the golden blur of days filled with purpose and possibility. I painted prolifically, filling our small apartment with canvases that Linda generously pretended to enjoy. I wrote stories about my childhood, my marriage, the fire, my rebirth. Some of them were true, some of them were fiction, all of them were mine. I made friends beyond the painting group. There was Maria from the bodega downstairs, who taught me to make her grandmother's recipe for tres leches cake. There was James from the community center computer lab, a retired librarian who helped me research genealogy and discovered ancestors I had never known existed. There was Dr. Patricia Kim, the young doctor who had become my primary care physician and who treated me like a whole person rather than a collection of age-related ailments. Michael continued to write, less frequently as the years passed, his letters becoming shorter and more desperate as he realized I wasn't going to respond. The last one arrived on my 77th birthday, and I threw it away unopened. Linda found me standing by the trash can, staring down at the envelope with his prison block letters spelling out my name. "Do you want to know what it says?" she asked gently. "No," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "I already know everything I need to know about Michael. He tried to kill me for money. Nothing in that letter is going to change that fact or make it acceptable. My energy is better spent on people who care whether I live or die." That afternoon, Linda organized a surprise birthday party in our apartment. Nothing elaborate, just Ruth and Maria and James and Dr. Kim and a few other friends who had become my chosen family. We ate tres leches cake and drank wine and looked through photo albums from our Taiwan trip. When they asked me to make a wish before blowing out the candles, I closed my eyes and wished for more years just like these, more days of choosing myself without apology. The wish has been granted, at least so far. I'm 79 now, and while my joints ache more than they used to and my memory isn't quite as sharp as it once was, I wake up every morning grateful to be alive. Not just alive in the biological sense, but alive in all the ways that matter. Curious about what the day might bring. Excited about the painting I'm working on. Planning trips with Linda and looking forward to Sunday dinners with our chosen family of friends. Sometimes, when I'm walking through the neighborhood or sitting in Sarah Delano Roosevelt Park with my easel, I think about that night 5 years ago when I woke up to smoke and realized my son was trying to kill me. I remember the terror, the betrayal, the heartbreak of understanding that the child I had loved more than my own life had chosen money over my existence. But I also remember the moment I decided to jump from that roof to Mrs. Chen's fire escape. The moment I chose myself over the familiar prison of family obligation. The moment I decided that I deserved to live, not just survive, but actually live with joy and purpose and freedom. The fire destroyed my house, my possessions, my illusions about motherhood and sacrifice and the unconditional love that supposedly flows from parent to child. But it also burned away everything that wasn't essential, everything that wasn't authentically me. I rose from those ashes as Eleanor Hamilton, not Michael's mother or anyone else's appendage, but a complete person with her own dreams and desires and right to exist. I think about all the women my age who are still trapped in relationships that diminish them, still giving and giving until there's nothing left but resentment and exhaustion. I think about the mothers who are enabling adult children who see them as ATMs rather than human beings. I think about the wives who are caring for husbands who never learn to say thank you. I think about the grandmothers who babysit constantly for children who grow up taking their sacrifice for granted. There's a difference between loving people and letting them destroy you in the name of that love. There's a difference between being generous and being a victim. There's a difference between putting family first and putting yourself last. It took me 73 years and an attempted murder to learn these distinctions, but I learned them. If you're listening to this story and recognizing yourself in my experience, if you're exhausted from giving to people who only take, if you're tired of loving people who see your love as weakness to exploit rather than gift to treasure, I want you to know that it's never too late to choose yourself. It's never too late to set boundaries, to say no, to walk away from relationships that are slowly killing your spirit. You don't have to wait for someone to literally set your house on fire to realize that you deserve better. You don't have to hit rock bottom to start climbing toward the light. You don't have to lose everything to discover that the most important thing you have is yourself, and that self is worth protecting and nurturing and celebrating. I know it's scary. I know it feels selfish. I know you've been told that family comes first, that blood is thicker than water, that good mothers/daughters/wives sacrifice everything for the people they love. But what if those messages are wrong? What if the people who taught them to you were just passing on their own misery and calling it virtue? What if your first obligation is to yourself? What if you can love people without enabling their worst behaviors? What if setting boundaries is actually healthier for everyone involved? What if saying no is sometimes the most loving thing you can do? I can't promise that choosing yourself will be easy. I lost my son, my home, my old identity, most of my possessions, and several decades of my life to the illusion that love means endless sacrifice. The path to freedom was painful and frightening and sometimes lonely. But on the other side of that pain is a life worth living, a self worth knowing, a future worth pursuing. My name is Eleanor Hamilton. I'm 79 years old, and I survived my own son's attempt to murder me for insurance money. But that's not the most important thing about me anymore. The most important thing is that I learned to choose myself, to value my own life, to build happiness that belongs to me rather than existing for other people's convenience. I learned to paint badly and joyfully. I learned to travel to places I had only read about in books. I learned to make friends who care about my well-being rather than my bank account. I learned that home isn't a house or even a family. Home is wherever you can be authentically yourself without apology. I learned that it's never too late to start over, to try something new, to become whoever you want to be. I learned that aging doesn't have to mean decline, it can mean liberation from all the roles and expectations that kept you small. I learned that the best years of your life might be the ones you hadn't planned for, the ones that come after you thought your story was already written. Most importantly, I learned that you can't love other people properly until you learn to love yourself. You can't give from an empty cup. You can't set yourself on fire to keep others warm. The people who are worth having in your life will want you to be happy, not just useful. The people who only value you for what you can provide aren't people, they're parasites, and you have the right to protect yourself from them even if you share their DNA. 5 years after my son tried to kill me, I can honestly say I'm grateful for that night. Not grateful for the trauma or the betrayal or the loss, but grateful for the wake-up call. Grateful for the chance to discover who I really am when I'm not performing the role of the perfect, selfless mother. Grateful for the opportunity to build a life based on my own values rather than other people's demands. If you're still sacrificing yourself on the altar of family obligation, if you're still hoping that enough love will eventually be returned, if you're still making excuses for people who treat you badly because they happen to be related to you, I want to ask you something. What would your life look like if you mattered as much as everyone else? What would you do if you believed you deserved happiness? Who would you be if you weren't constantly trying to earn love through service? Those aren't just rhetorical questions. They're invitations to imagine a different future, a different relationship with yourself and the people around you. They're possibilities that exist right now, regardless of your age, your circumstances, your family history, or your past choices. You matter. Your happiness matters. Your well-being matters. Your dreams matter. You don't have to earn the right to exist, and you don't have to purchase love with endless sacrifice. The people who are supposed to love you should love you because of who you are, not because of what you can do for them. I know some of you listening to this story have been making excuses for people who don't deserve them. I know some of you are trapped in relationships that are slowly destroying your spirit. I know some of you have forgotten that you're allowed to want things for yourself, to have boundaries, to say no without explaining or apologizing. Here's what I want you to remember: it's never too late to choose yourself. It's never too late to start over. It's never too late to discover that the most authentic version of yourself might be the one you've been hiding to make other people comfortable. The fire that burns away everything false in your life isn't a tragedy, it's a liberation. Have you ever found yourself in a situation like mine? Have you ever loved someone who saw your love as weakness to exploit? Have you ever sacrificed so much of yourself that you forgot who you were supposed to be? Tell me your story in the comments below. Share your experience with choosing yourself, setting boundaries, or walking away from relationships that were destroying your spirit. Let's build a community of people who understand that love doesn't require martyrdom, that family doesn't excuse abuse, that it's never too late to reclaim your own life. And if this story resonated with you, if you found even a small piece of yourself in my experience, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. It helps me reach other people who need to hear that they're not alone, that their stories matter, that their happiness is worth fighting for. Together, we can remind each other that we all deserve to be loved for who we are, not what we can provide. We all deserve to choose ourselves without apology. We all deserve to live lives that feel authentic and joyful, regardless of what anyone else thinks we owe them. Let me tell you about something that happened just last week, because I think it shows how much I've changed, how far I've come from that woman who used to apologize for breathing. Linda and I were at the grocery store, loading our cart with ingredients for one of our experimental cooking adventures. This time we were going to try making her grandmother's recipe for beef noodle soup from memory and hope for the best. As we stood in the checkout line, I heard a familiar voice behind me. Sharp, demanding, the kind of tone that makes cashiers flinch and other customers look away. I turned around and saw a woman about my son's age, maybe 40, berating the teenage cashier because her coupon had expired and wouldn't scan. "This is ridiculous," she was saying, her voice getting louder with each word. "I drove all the way here specifically for this sale. Do you have any idea how busy I am? I don't have time for this incompetence." The cashier, a young man who couldn't have been more than 17, was turning red with embarrassment and stress. His hands were shaking as he tried to explain the store's coupon policy, but the woman wasn't interested in explanations. She wanted someone to blame for her inconvenience, and this kid was an easy target. A year ago, I would have looked away. I would have pretended not to notice, the way I had pretended not to notice when Michael screamed at waitresses or store clerks or anyone else who couldn't fight back. I would have told myself it wasn't my business, that I shouldn't get involved, that confrontation was dangerous and unladylike. But I'm not that woman anymore. The woman who died in that fire would have stayed silent. Eleanor Hamilton, the woman who rose from those ashes, couldn't let it pass. I stepped out of my place in line and walked over to where the woman was creating her scene. "Excuse me," I said, my voice calm but carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet store. "I couldn't help but notice you're having trouble with your coupon." She turned to me with the kind of irritation people reserve for interruptions to their righteous anger. "Yes, I am. This store's policies are absolutely ridiculous, and this cashier doesn't know what he's doing." I looked at the coupon she was waving around. It had expired 3 weeks ago. "Ma'am," I said gently, "this coupon expired on the 15th. It's now the 7th of the next month." The cashier is doing his job correctly. Her face flushed red. "Well, who are you to interfere? Mind your own business." Before she could continue her tirade, I looked directly at the young cashier. His name tag read Marcus, and he looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "Marcus," I said, loud enough for everyone in the surrounding area to hear, "you're doing a great job. You're being professional and polite even when it's difficult. Your managers should be proud of you." Then I turned back to the angry woman. "Ma'am, I know you're frustrated, but taking that frustration out on people who are just trying to do their jobs isn't going to solve your problem. It's only going to make everyone's day worse, including your own." The woman stared at me as if I had slapped her. She looked around at the other customers, who were now openly watching the exchange, and seemed to realize for the first time that her behavior was drawing attention. I just needed to use this coupon," she said, her voice smaller now, uncertain. "I understand," I said. "But the coupon is expired, so that's not possible. However, I noticed that the item you're trying to buy is actually on sale this week for the same price the coupon would have given you. Marcus, can you check the current promotions?" Marcus, bless his heart, practically smiled with relief as he scanned the woman's item. "Yes, ma'am, it's marked down to $3.99 this week. The same price as your expired coupon would have given you." The woman's entire demeanor shifted. The fight went out of her shoulders, and she suddenly looked tired rather than angry. "Oh," she said quietly. I didn't realize. I'm sorry. I've been having a difficult week, but that's no excuse for taking it out on you." Marcus accepted her apology with the kind of grace that restored my faith in young people. As the woman gathered her groceries and left, looking slightly embarrassed but no longer belligerent, several other customers smiled at me and nodded their approval. Linda, who had watched the entire exchange from our place in line, was grinning when I rejoined her. "Look at you," she said, her eyes twinkling with pride. "Standing up for people, setting boundaries, refusing to let bullies get away with bad behavior. The old Eleanor would never have done that." She was right. The old Eleanor would have been terrified of confrontation, would have worried about making the situation worse, would have convinced herself that it wasn't her place to interfere. The old Eleanor had spent so many years being yelled at and manipulated that she had forgotten how to recognize abuse when she saw it happening to others, let alone how to stop it. But this Eleanor, the one who had crawled through smoke and jumped from rooftops and testified against her own son in a court of law, this Eleanor had learned that silence in the face of cruelty makes you complicit in it. This Eleanor had learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is speak up for people who can't speak up for themselves. The incident got me thinking about all the ways my son had trained me to accept unacceptable behavior, not just from him but from everyone around me. He had taught me that my feelings didn't matter, that my comfort was less important than avoiding conflict, that keeping the peace was worth any amount of personal sacrifice. He had modeled cruelty as normal, manipulation as love, and emotional abuse as just another part of family life. I had carried those lessons into every other relationship I had. I had let friends take advantage of my generosity without reciprocation. I had smiled and agreed with people whose opinions I found repugnant because I was afraid of causing offense. I had apologized for things that weren't my fault and accepted responsibility for other people's emotions and actions. The fire had burned away more than my house, it had burned away the learned helplessness that Michael had spent decades instilling in me. In learning to save myself, I had remembered that I was worth saving. In choosing myself over his deadly expectations, I had rediscovered my own power. That power isn't about domination or control. It's about recognizing my own worth, setting healthy boundaries, and refusing to participate in systems that diminish anyone's humanity. It's about speaking up when I see injustice, even when it's uncomfortable. It's about modeling the kind of behavior I want to see in the world, especially when nobody else seems willing to do it. Last month, Linda and I started volunteering at a local women's shelter, helping with their art therapy program. Many of the women there are my age or older, refugees from decades of domestic violence who finally found the courage to leave relationships that were killing them slowly. They arrive with nothing but the clothes on their backs and stories that would break your heart. Working with these women has shown me how lucky I was, in a twisted way, that Michael's abuse escalated to attempted murder. It forced a crisis that made the choice clear: leave or die. These women endured years or decades of psychological abuse that never quite crossed the line into the illegal, manipulation that left no visible scars, financial control that made leaving seem impossible. One woman, Margaret, is 82 years old. Her husband never hit her, never threatened to kill her, never did anything that would have gotten him arrested. He just spent 57 years systematically destroying her self-esteem, isolating her from friends and family, making her believe that she was stupid and worthless and lucky that anyone would tolerate her existence. When he died last year, Margaret discovered that she had no idea who she was without his constant criticism and control. She had never made a decision without his approval, never had an opinion he hadn't shaped, never even chosen her own clothes without considering whether they would meet with his satisfaction. She came to the shelter not because she was fleeing physical danger, but because she was terrified of the freedom his death had given her. Margaret and I paint together every Thursday afternoon. She started with tentative pencil sketches, afraid to use color because her husband had always said she had no artistic sense. Now she creates bold, vibrant watercolors that practically sing with joy. Last week, she finished a painting of a garden in full bloom and started crying as she looked at it. "I had no idea I could make something beautiful," she said, her voice full of wonder. "He always told me I was clumsy and tasteless. He said I ruined everything I touched. But look at this, I made this with my own hands, and it's actually beautiful." I looked at her painting, which truly was beautiful, but more than that, I looked at Margaret herself. The timid, apologetic woman who had arrived at the shelter 6 months ago had been replaced by someone who was beginning to discover her own power. She was learning what I had learned, that the people who tell you that you're worthless are usually the ones who are most threatened by your potential. Working with these women has also taught me about the different forms that abuse can take, and how many of them I had normalized in my relationship with Michael. He had never hit me, so I told myself it wasn't really abuse. He had never threatened to kill me until that final night, so I convinced myself that his behavior was just difficult rather than dangerous. But emotional abuse is still abuse. Financial exploitation is still exploitation. Manipulation is still manipulation, regardless of whether it comes from a romantic partner, a parent, a child, or a friend. The damage done to your spirit, your self-esteem, your sense of reality is real damage, even if it doesn't leave physical scars. I had spent decades accepting treatment from Michael that I would never have accepted from a stranger. I had made excuses for him that I would never have made for anyone else. I had given him chances and second chances and third chances long past the point where his behavior had proven who he really was. All because he was my son, because family was supposed to be forever, because mothers were supposed to love unconditionally. But love without boundaries isn't love, it's enabling. And families that demand unconditional acceptance of abuse aren't families, they're cults. The blood relation that I thought made Michael's treatment of me acceptable actually made it worse, because it came with the expectation that I would endure it forever without complaint. One of the most healing parts of my work at the shelter has been helping other women recognize that they deserve better than they've been accepting. I see myself in their stories, their hesitations, their carefully worded justifications for other people's bad behavior. I understand the fear of starting over, the worry about being alone, the belief that maybe they somehow deserve what they've been getting. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love us the most are the ones who hurt us the worst, I told a group of women during a workshop last week. And sometimes the kindest thing we can do for ourselves and for them is to refuse to participate in that dynamic anymore. A woman named Carol, who had left her abusive husband after 43 years of marriage, raised her hand. But how do you know when you're giving up too easily? How do you know when you should keep fighting for the relationship? It was a question I had asked myself countless times over the years. When is persistence love, and when is it self-destruction? When is loyalty admirable, and when is it foolish? I think the answer is in how the other person responds to your requests for basic respect, I said. If someone truly loves you, they'll be horrified to learn that their behavior is hurting you, and they'll work to change it. If someone is just using you, they'll get angry that you dare to ask for better treatment, and they'll try to make you feel guilty for having boundaries. I thought about all the times I had asked Michael to treat me with basic respect, to contribute to the household, to stop bringing strangers into my home, to get his life together. His response had never been to acknowledge my feelings or work on himself. It had always been to make me feel selfish for asking, to turn the conversation back to his needs and his problems, to make me responsible for his emotional regulation and financial support. People who love you want you to be happy. They want you to be healthy and safe and fulfilled. They don't see your well-being as a threat to their own. They don't punish you for having needs or setting boundaries. They don't make you choose between your own sanity and their approval. Michael had never wanted me to be happy, he had wanted me to be useful. He hadn't cared about my well-being, he had cared about my ability to provide for his wants. He hadn't loved me, he had loved what I could do for him. And when I finally couldn't do enough, when my resources ran out and my resentment started showing, he had tried to eliminate me rather than evaluate his own behavior. Understanding this distinction has changed not just how I think about my relationship with Michael, but how I approach all my relationships now. I pay attention to how people respond when I have needs, when I set boundaries, when I can't give them what they want. The people worth having in my life respond with understanding and respect. The people I need to keep at arm's length respond with manipulation and guilt trips. Linda is a perfect example of healthy relationship dynamics. When I told her I needed some alone time to process my feelings about the anniversary of the fire, she didn't take it personally or try to talk me out of it. She simply asked what she could do to support me and then gave me the space I needed. When I declined her invitation to visit her daughter's family for Christmas because I wasn't ready for that kind of family gathering, she understood and made alternative plans without making me feel guilty. That's what love looks like. It's consideration for the other person's well-being, respect for their boundaries, acceptance of their limitations. It's not perfect, Linda and I have had our disagreements and misunderstandings, but it's based on mutual care rather than exploitation. I think about Michael trying to burn me alive, and I realize that his willingness to literally murder me for money was just the final escalation of a pattern that had been going on for years. He had been killing me slowly, bit by bit, stealing my time and energy and resources and self-respect until there was almost nothing left. The fire was just his attempt to finish the job more efficiently. But I didn't let him finish it. I saved myself, not just from the fire but from the relationship that had been consuming me for decades. I chose my own life over his convenience, my own future over his expectations. I refused to be a martyr to motherhood or a victim of family obligation. The woman who crawled through that smoke and jumped from that roof was not the same woman who had been enabling Michael's abuse for 35 years. She was someone I had forgotten I could be, strong, resourceful, determined to survive. She was the woman I had been before I learned to make myself smaller, before I accepted that my purpose in life was to serve others without regard for my own well-being. Now, as I approach my 80th birthday, I'm more myself than I've ever been. I wake up every morning in an apartment I own, next to a friend who values me, with a day ahead of me that belongs entirely to me. I make decisions based on what I want rather than what someone else needs. I spend my money on things that bring me joy rather than things that enable someone else's irresponsibility. I surround myself with people who add to my life rather than subtract from it. This doesn't mean I've become selfish or callous. I volunteer at the women's shelter, I help my neighbors, I support causes I care about. But I do these things because I choose to, not because I feel obligated to. I give from abundance rather than emptiness, from strength rather than weakness, from love rather than fear. The difference is that I no longer set myself on fire to keep other people warm. I no longer sacrifice my well-being to avoid other people's discomfort. I no longer accept responsibility for emotions and choices that belong to someone else. I've learned the difference between compassion and codependence, between generosity and enabling, between love and martyrdom. If someone had told me at 73 that the best years of my life were still ahead of me, I would have thought they were delusional. I was old, tired, poor, trapped in a relationship that was slowly killing my spirit. I couldn't imagine a future that didn't revolve around Michael's needs and demands and crises. I couldn't picture myself as anything other than his mother, his caretaker, his endless source of support and forgiveness. The fire changed all of that. It forced me to see the truth about my life, to acknowledge that love without reciprocation isn't love at all, to understand that some relationships are too toxic to survive. It gave me permission to choose myself, to start over, to become the woman I was always meant to be. Now I know that it's never too late to reclaim your life. It's never too late to set boundaries, to pursue your dreams, to surround yourself with people who celebrate rather than tolerate your existence. It's never too late to learn new skills, make new friends, discover new parts of yourself that have been buried under years of other people's expectations. Age doesn't disqualify you from happiness. Being alone doesn't mean being lonely. Starting over doesn't mean admitting failure. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is walk away from a situation that everyone else thinks you should endure. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's destruction of themselves and everyone around them. I look at my life now, my little apartment filled with amateur paintings and the sound of Linda's laughter, my calendar full of art classes and volunteer work and coffee dates with friends, my bank account healthy for the first time in decades because I'm not supporting someone else's addictions and delusions, and I feel a kind of contentment I never experienced in all those years of so-called sacrifice. This is what peace feels like. This is what freedom feels like. This is what it means to live a life that belongs to you rather than simply existing for other people's convenience. This is the gift that rose from the ashes of that terrible night when my own son tried to kill me for money. I often think about what would have happened if the fire hadn't forced a crisis, if Michael had continued his slow-motion destruction of my life without ever crossing the line into attempted murder. Would I still be there, in that house, working myself to death to support his lifestyle while he counted the days until my natural death would make him rich? Would I have died of exhaustion and heartbreak, never knowing that there was another way to live? The thought terrifies me more than the memory of smoke filling my lungs. At least the fire was honest about its intention to destroy me. The relationship I had with Michael was dishonest, disguised as love while it slowly poisoned everything it touched. The fire was a clean enemy, the relationship was a cancer, spreading so gradually that I didn't recognize how sick I had become until I was nearly dead. But I survived both. I crawled through the honest fire and escaped from the dishonest love, and now I'm here to tell other people that survival is possible. Recovery is possible. A life of joy and purpose and authentic relationships is possible, even after decades of accepting less than you deserved. You don't have to wait for a literal fire to wake up to the truth about your relationships. You don't have to wait for someone to try to kill you to recognize that they've already been slowly destroying your spirit. You can choose yourself right now, today, without waiting for a crisis to give you permission. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for caring about an old woman's journey from victim to survivor to someone who finally learned that the most important relationship she would ever have was the one with herself. May you find the courage to write your own story of liberation, and may it be everything you never dared to dream it could be.